There is a crop that breaks every rule of modern gardening. Plant it once, and it feeds your family for 20 years. It produces 3 times more food per square foot than potatoes. It survives winters that kill tomatoes and droughts that destroy corn. You never buy seeds again because it multiplies itself underground, spreading like nature's own insurance policy against hunger. For centuries, it was the foundation of food security. Then the industrial agriculture complex erased it from memory, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. A crop that feeds families without annual purchases cannot generate perpetual profits. This is the story of the perennial vegetable revolution that could transform how humanity grows food forever. Before we unlock this vault of forgotten abundance, if these revelations matter to you, the simplest way to preserve this knowledge is to subscribe, hit the bell, and share these discoveries with those who need to remember what we lost. The story begins in a suburban backyard in Ohio in 1995. Maria Santos plants 3 small tubers in a corner patch behind her garage. She waters them once and forgets about them entirely. The following spring, thick green shoots emerge from the soil without any human intervention. By summer, towering stems reach 8 feet high, crowned with bright yellow flowers that follow the sun across the sky. But the real miracle is happening underground. When October arrives, Maria digs where she planted those 3 tubers. She unearths 47 pounds of food from a space the size of a kitchen table. Knobby, irregular tubers fill 5 grocery bags. She planted 3 and harvested hundreds. The mathematics seem impossible until you understand what perennial vegetables actually do. Unlike annuals that live for one season and die, perennials establish root systems that expand year after year. They store energy underground, building vast networks of tubers, rhizomes, and storage organs that function like natural food banks. Each year, the harvest multiplies without additional planting, additional seeds, or additional cost. Plant once, harvest forever. Maria had stumbled upon Jerusalem artichokes, also called sunchokes, one of North America's most productive perennial crops. Native tribes cultivated them for thousands of years alongside corn, beans, and squash. Lewis and Clark survived their expedition across the Dakotas because Sacagawea found mouse caches filled with thousands of these tubers stored underground for winter. One plant produces several pounds of food. 1 acre yields 15 tons without irrigation. But Jerusalem artichokes are just the beginning. There exists an entire category of perennial vegetables that industrial agriculture has systematically ignored. Not because they produce less food, but because they produce more food with less control. Crops that replant themselves cannot be sold as seeds every season. Plants that thrive without chemical inputs cannot justify fertilizer purchases. Vegetables that last decades cannot generate annual revenue streams. Asparagus exemplifies this perfectly. Plant asparagus crowns once, and they produce for 30 years. During peak season, spears grow 2 inches per day. A well-maintained asparagus bed yields fresh vegetables for 3 decades from a single planting. The first harvest requires patience. You cannot cut spears for 3 years while the root system establishes. But once productive, asparagus beds become family legacies passed down through generations. The economics are staggering. 1 asparagus crown costs $3. Over 20 years, it produces approximately 60 pounds of vegetables worth $400 at grocery store prices. The return on investment exceeds 10,000%, but the real value goes beyond money. Asparagus harvests begin in early spring when grocery stores charge premium prices for fresh vegetables. Your garden provides abundance when commercial crops are still seeds in the ground. Ramps represent another example of perennial abundance. These wild leeks carpet forest floors across eastern North America every spring. They taste like garlic and onions combined, selling for $20 per pound at farmers markets. But ramps take 7 years to mature from seed, making commercial cultivation nearly impossible. Nature produces them freely in shaded woodlands, but patience is required. Plant ramp bulbs today, and your grandchildren will harvest them decades later. The pattern repeats across dozens of perennial vegetables. Walking onions plant themselves, dropping bulblets that root into new plants without human intervention. Egyptian walking onions march across garden beds, establishing new colonies each year. Perennial kale survives harsh winters and produces leaves for 5 years from one planting. Groundnut vines climb fences while producing protein-rich tubers underground. Sea kale thrives in coastal conditions where annual crops fail entirely. These crops share common characteristics that explain why they disappeared from modern agriculture. They cannot be harvested by machines designed for uniform, simultaneous ripening. They mature at different rates, requiring hand harvesting over extended periods. They resist genetic modification because their wild genetics have been perfected by millennia of natural selection. They reproduce freely through division, runners, and self-seeding, making seed sales unnecessary. Most critically, perennial vegetables require long-term thinking. Industrial agriculture operates on quarterly profit cycles. Shareholders demand immediate returns. Perennial crops require years to establish but then produce for decades. The timeline conflicts with short-term financial models, so the entire category was abandoned in favor of annuals that require constant inputs and annual purchases. The shift happened gradually over the past century. Seed catalogs from the 1920s featured dozens of perennial vegetables. Modern catalogs focus almost exclusively on annuals. Agricultural colleges stopped teaching perennial cultivation techniques. Extension services published guides for eliminating wild perennials from crop fields. Knowledge that sustained families for generations was systematically erased from institutional memory. But the plants survived. They grow wild in abandoned lots, forgotten corners, and neglected gardens. They persist in ethnic communities that never abandoned traditional food systems. They thrive in permaculture gardens where long-term abundance matters more than short-term convenience. Climate change is forcing a reconsideration. As droughts intensify and growing seasons become unpredictable, the resilience of perennial food systems becomes increasingly valuable. Deep root systems access water that annual crops cannot reach. Established perennials survive extreme weather that destroys annual plantings. Diverse perennial gardens spread risk across multiple species and harvest seasons. The mathematics of perennial abundance challenge everything we believe about food production. One Jerusalem artichoke plant produces enough tubers to feed a family for weeks. One asparagus bed provides fresh vegetables for 3 decades. One ramp patch supplies gourmet ingredients indefinitely. The productivity per square foot exceeds any annual crop when calculated over time. Yet most gardeners remain trapped in annual thinking. Every spring they purchase seeds, transplants, and soil amendments. Every fall they compost dead plants and prepare for next year's purchases. The cycle repeats endlessly, generating profits for suppliers while keeping gardeners dependent on external inputs. Perennial vegetables offer escape from this cycle. Plant once and the investment compounds annually. No seed purchases, no yearly soil preparation, no constant replanting. The garden becomes a living bank account that pays dividends in fresh food forever. The resistance to perennial abundance runs deeper than agricultural ignorance. It threatens the fundamental business model of modern food production. Consider what happens when communities embrace perennial vegetables. Seed companies lose annual customers. Fertilizer manufacturers lose recurring sales. Pesticide corporations lose repeat business. Equipment dealers lose replacement cycles. The entire infrastructure of industrial agriculture depends on crops that die and require replacement. This explains why Jerusalem artichokes are classified as weeds in agricultural textbooks. Why asparagus is relegated to specialty crops despite outproducing most annuals over time. Why ramps are called invasive when they simply reproduce without permission. The language itself reveals the bias. Plants that succeed without corporate inputs become problems to solve rather than solutions to embrace. The conspiracy goes beyond simple market forces. Agricultural universities receive funding from corporations that profit from annual crop cycles. Research focuses on developing hybrid varieties that cannot reproduce true to type, forcing farmers to purchase new seeds every season. Extension programs teach elimination of wild perennials rather than cultivation techniques that could feed communities indefinitely. Wealth accumulates through perennial investments that compound over time rather than annual expenses that drain resources indefinitely. The transition requires patience that modern culture has forgotten. Asparagus crowns sit dormant for 3 years while roots establish underground networks capable of supporting decades of harvests. Jerusalem artichokes produce modest yields the first season while building energy reserves for exponential expansion. Ramps grow slowly for 7 years before reaching reproductive maturity that sustains centuries of abundance. This timeline conflicts with instant gratification expectations. Gardeners want immediate results from spring plantings. They expect quick returns on garden investments. They abandon projects that require years of development for long-term benefits. The perennial approach delivers superior returns by every financial metric. The environmental benefits compound these economic advantages. Perennial root systems sequester carbon that annual cultivation releases. Deep roots prevent soil erosion that destroys farmland worldwide. Diverse perennial plantings support beneficial insects that annual monocultures eliminate. Established perennial gardens require minimal water, while annual crops demand constant irrigation. Climate resilience becomes increasingly critical as weather patterns shift unpredictably. Perennial vegetables survive extreme conditions that destroy annual crops entirely. When late freezes kill tomato transplants, asparagus spears emerge unaffected. When drought stresses corn and beans, Jerusalem artichokes continue producing tubers using stored underground energy. When floods wash away annual gardens, perennial root systems anchor soil and regenerate quickly. The solution exists in forgotten corners of suburban neighborhoods. Behind abandoned houses, Jerusalem artichokes tower above weeds, producing tons of food that nobody harvests. Along rural fence lines, wild ramps carpet forest floors with gourmet vegetables that restaurants pay premium prices to source. In neglected garden beds, asparagus spears emerge each spring from crowns planted by previous homeowners decades earlier. These accidental food forests demonstrate what intentional perennial cultivation could accomplish. Imagine neighborhoods where every yard contains productive perennial beds, where children learn to identify edible plants that return annually without planting, where communities share surplus harvests from crops that multiply faster than families can consume them. The knowledge transfer requires hands-on experience rather than theoretical understanding. Plant Jerusalem artichoke tubers in autumn and witness their spring emergence without human intervention. Establish asparagus beds and count spears that multiply yearly from underground crowns. Divide walking onion clumps and watch them march across garden beds, establishing new colonies independently. Each success builds confidence in perennial systems while reducing dependence on annual purchases. Gardeners discover that abundance flows from patience rather than constant activity. That wealth accumulates through long-term investments rather than yearly expenses. That food security comes from plants that persist rather than crops that require replacement. The perennial vegetable revolution begins with individual choices to plant differently, to think beyond single seasons toward generational abundance, to value crops that multiply themselves rather than requiring constant inputs, to embrace patience that builds lasting wealth rather than pursuing quick results that generate ongoing costs. The corporations profiting from annual crop cycles cannot prevent this transition. They cannot patent Jerusalem artichokes that reproduce freely through underground tubers. They cannot genetically modify asparagus that has thrived for millennia without human interference. They cannot control ramps that spread through forest networks beyond commercial cultivation. The revolution begins in your backyard. Every perennial vegetable you plant becomes an act of rebellion against a system designed to keep you dependent. Every asparagus crown you establish breaks the cycle of annual purchases that drain your wealth while enriching corporations. Every Jerusalem artichoke tuber you bury creates abundance that multiplies beyond their control. The choice is simple. Continue buying seeds that die every season, fertilizers that deplete your soil, and transplants that require replacement forever. Or plant once and eat free for decades. Establish food systems that serve your family rather than shareholders. Build wealth that compounds rather than expenses that repeat eternally. The plants are waiting, in abandoned lots, forgotten gardens, and wild spaces where they persist despite systematic elimination. Jerusalem artichokes tower above weeds, producing tons of food that nobody harvests. Asparagus emerges each spring from crowns planted by families who understood what we forgot. Ramps carpet forest floors with gourmet abundance that costs nothing but patience. Start small. Plant 3 Jerusalem artichoke tubers this autumn and harvest 47 pounds next fall. Establish 1 asparagus bed and feed your family for 30 years. The mathematics of perennial abundance will convert you from consumer to producer, from dependent to sovereign. The industrial agriculture complex spent a century erasing this knowledge because perennial vegetables threaten their profits. But they cannot erase the plants themselves. The seeds of revolution grow in your soil, waiting for hands willing to plant once and harvest forever. If this vault opened your eyes to what they tried to hide, subscribe to preserve this wisdom and share it with everyone who needs to remember. The perennial revolution begins with you. Plant once, eat free forever.